What if I told you that the most dangerous place on Earth in the 1880s wasn't a battlefield, it was a hospital? And what if the very doctors and nurses tasked with saving lives were unknowingly breeding a killer right next to their patients' beds? In 1881, France sent the greatest engineers civilization had ever produced to do something no empire had ever done: carve a canal through the spine of the American continent. They had unlimited funding. They had the finest machines money could buy. They had the man who had just conquered the Sahara Desert, and the jungle ate every single one of them alive. This is the story of how a microscopic, invisible enemy defeated the 19th century's most confident empire, and what they did with the bodies. To understand what went wrong in Panama, you first have to understand the man who started it. In 1869, a French diplomat named Ferdinand de Lesseps did something the world had said was impossible. He carved a canal through the Egyptian desert at Suez, connecting the Mediterranean to the Red Sea and slashing weeks off global trade routes. The world went insane for him. De Lesseps was paraded through Paris like a Roman conqueror. He wasn't an engineer, he was a diplomat, but after Suez, nobody seemed to care. So in 1879, when de Lesseps stood before the Paris Geographical Congress and announced he would build a second canal, this time through the jungles of Panama, nearly every hand in that room shot up in support. There was, however, one dissenting voice. An alarmed engineer named de L'Épinay stood up and warned the room that Panama was nothing like Egypt. He proposed a completely different design, a lock and dam system, arguing that a sea-level cut would be catastrophically impossible. He was one of only 8 delegates to vote no. De Lesseps dismissed him. The vote passed. The digging began. Hold on to this. De L'Épinay was right. The world was about to find out exactly how right, at a cost of over 22,000 lives. But before we get to the catastrophe, there's something about this jungle no one on the French team understood, and it starts with an invisible enemy that was already waiting for them when they landed. The French arrived in Panama armed with the best scientific knowledge of their era, and that was precisely the problem. In 1881, doctors and engineers alike believed in what was called miasma theory, the idea that diseases like yellow fever and malaria were caused by toxic vapors rising from disturbed soil and rotting organic matter. The solution, they believed, was fresh air and sanitary surroundings. What they didn't know, what no one yet knew, was that yellow fever and malaria weren't carried by air. They were carried by mosquitoes, and every solution the French implemented was about to turn their camp into the perfect mosquito paradise. Take the Ancon Hospital, the flagship French medical facility. The nurses, following miasma protocol, threw the windows wide open to let the bad air escape. This let mosquitoes fly freely in, feed on patients burning with yellow fever, and carry the pathogen straight back to healthy workers sleeping in adjacent beds. To keep ants away from patients, nurses placed the legs of every hospital bed in small open tins of clean, still water. The Aedes aegypti mosquito, the sole carrier of yellow fever, breeds exclusively in clean, still, domestic water. The nurses had unknowingly installed a breeding farm on every ward floor. They also placed decorative potted plants throughout the wards. Every water-filled plant pot, another nursery. Entering the French hospital for a broken arm was, statistically, a death sentence. But it wasn't just the workers dying. It was the people at the very top. And what happened to one man's family inside that jungle is almost too dark to put into words. The director of engineering, Jules Dingler, arrived in 1883 with his wife, his daughter, his son, and his daughter's fiancé. He toured the works in a private $42,000 rail car and built a $150,000 mansion on Ancon Hill, overlooking the jungle. He mocked the disease publicly. "Only drunkards and the dissipated die of yellow fever," he declared. Within 18 months, yellow fever had taken his daughter, then his son, then the fiancé, then his wife. In a state of complete psychological collapse, Dingler ordered his family's prized thoroughbred horses to be shot in the street. He abandoned his palace and sailed back to France, where he died shortly after. And while all of this was happening, the jungle itself was fighting a separate war on the construction site. The continental divide at Culebra wasn't stable rock. It was a volatile cocktail of volcanic clay, shale, and mud that behaved less like stone and more like warm porridge. Every time the French excavated downward, the mountain walls slid inward, burying locomotives and filling the trench overnight. They were digging the same hole, over and over again. Then the Chagres River would flood. In the rainy season, that slow, scenic river could rise 40 feet within hours, sweeping away heavy machinery and refilling freshly dug channels with millions of tons of mountain silt. By the mid-1880s, the death toll had become impossible to manage, physically and morally. At peak periods, over 200 workers were dying every month. The jungle soil was saturated. The graves were overflowing. And here is where the story takes a turn that most history books quietly skip over. To handle the overflow of unclaimed bodies, most of them nameless foreign laborers, canal and railroad officials made a business decision. The corpses were packed into wooden barrels filled with vinegar and brine and shipped to medical schools across Europe and North America, which paid handsomely for anatomical cadavers. The revenue from this international trade in pickled human bodies was then funneled back into funding the railroad's own hospital. The jungle hadn't just defeated France's finest engineers, it had turned their dead into a commodity. Back in Paris, de Lesseps knew the numbers were catastrophic, but he couldn't allow the public to find out. Progress reports were falsified. Investors were reassured with fabricated milestones. A desperate second bond issue was rushed through Parliament, and behind closed doors, cash was being quietly distributed to over 104 members of the French Parliament, including 6 cabinet ministers, to keep the authorizations flowing and the questions suppressed. By 1889, it was over. The company declared bankruptcy. The digging stopped. The jungle went quiet. I'm genuinely curious. At what point do you think de Lesseps knew it was finished? Drop your answer in the comments. The bankruptcy was devastating enough on its own. Then came the scandal. In 1892, journalists began pulling at the financial threads of the collapse, and what they found was a system of corruption so vast it reached into the highest offices of the French Republic. Baron de Reinach, the company's chief financial operator, committed suicide rather than face trial. Charles Bailhaut, the former Minister of Public Works, confessed on the stand to accepting 375,000 francs in bribes and was sent to prison. Ferdinand de Lesseps, his son Charles, and the iconic engineer Gustave Eiffel, who had designed the 11th-hour lock system in 1887, were all convicted of fraud and embezzlement. The sentences were eventually overturned on legal technicalities, but it didn't matter. The reputational damage was permanent. 800,000 French citizens, including 15,000 widows and single women who had invested their entire life savings, were financially wiped out. The total loss in modern terms exceeded $11 billion. The Panama Scandal shattered public faith in the French Republic so completely that its political aftershocks directly accelerated one of the most notorious injustices of the century, the Dreyfus Affair. 15 years later, the United States took over the project. But they did something the French had refused to do. They listened to a doctor, Dr. William Gorgas, armed with the newly proven mosquito vector theory, launched a systematic biological war. He fumigated every building in the canal zone, sealed every cistern, screened every window, and drained every swamp. Canal administrators called him a lunatic. The Isthmian Canal Commission petitioned President Roosevelt to fire him outright. When a yellow fever outbreak in 1905 sent 500 panicked American engineers fleeing the canal zone, the pressure to remove Gorgas became almost irresistible. It was Chief Engineer John Stevens who saved the entire project by threatening to halt all construction entirely unless Gorgas received full administrative support. Roosevelt backed Gorgas. Within 2 years, yellow fever had been eradicated from the canal zone completely. And the design? They used de L'Épinay's lock system, the same plan the Paris Congress had dismissed with a show of hands 26 years earlier. The wild Chagres River was dammed into a massive artificial lake. Ships were raised 85 feet by a series of concrete locks, sailed across the elevated water, and lowered back down on the Pacific side. The canal opened in 1914. The lesson isn't simply that France failed. The lesson is why. When empirical evidence was replaced by ideology, when dissenting engineers were voted down at dinner parties, and when a diplomat convinced an entire continent that confidence was the same thing as competence, the jungle collected its debt in full. If this kind of story is what brought you here, the disasters, the cover-ups, the moments when human hubris collided with reality, hit subscribe. There's a lot more where this came from.